You all hear that, right? Does it say it for you? Okay. It's just, I guess that's like just a mechanism so you can't accidentally, or you can't like
It
discreetly.
doesn't just say it, you have to hit the button that says got it. It says recording in
Oh,
progress, and then
wow.
you have to hit a button that says got it, which means I know I'm being recorded.
What happens if you don't hit got it?
The big square in the screen stays there. You have to
Yeah, you
accept it.
can't.
It says leave meeting or
Oh,
got it.
yeah, you get an option. That's great. Thanks, Zoom. Okay, so we'll do a quick hydrostasy review just because um, we can, I guess, you know. So again, we have the foundational practice, and that is really centered around creating strategies to become more present. And we've spent years talking about those strategies. And then we move into interaction with thought. In counterbalance, that is the rule of three. And when you're just starting out, it may seem monumental, like the task of redirection, because there were days where I might have even leaked power sometimes about it, because I'm just like, oh shit, like here I am again, just right back in that same stream of thought. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so I found myself redirecting probably entire days, entire weeks worth of time spent in redirection. Now, one of the common errors with redirection is after doing your redirection technique, not going back to a point of emphasis. So I remember I would do this too. I would do my rule of three and I'm like, oh, okay. And then I just go right back into the mindless nature. And then what happens? That stream of thought comes right back in and I need to redirect again. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, redirection does work. But then if I don't do anything after that, I'm just putting myself right back in the same position for the closed feedback loops to continue. So we do our rule of three, and then we go back to a point of emphasis. And by now we should have, or by that point in the training, we should have quite a few strategies developed on points of attention that feel comfortable for us, that feel accessible to us, that seem at least mildly interesting to some extent. You know, they're not going to be your latest action movie or anything usually in the beginning, but you know, it's because your mind isn't used to paying attention to it that makes it a valid point of attention. Warrior training is just like counterbalance, only we're turning it up a notch. So in the beginning, we do the original traps of thinking. We're not calling it the 3-strike rule anymore because there's too many threes and it doesn't make sense, as Gene pointed out a long time ago, that we shouldn't need all three. We just need one, and then check, time to redirect. So we go from counterbalance, which is redirecting repetitive, habitual thoughts that aren't making us feel inspired, especially if they're not making you feel well. Like if your train of thought is just making you feel more shitty, that's going to lend to thoughts that make you feel more shitty, and it's not creating any amount of space. So it's just a wasted act. The mind is just stuck. It's literally just stuck, like a computer program can get stuck and then you got to restart. So we go from foundational mindfulness, which is creating strategies to be more present. Those strategies will lend to the counterbalance phase when we start to redirect. And then when we're really all in, then we go into warrior training, which is redirecting. It's like 7 additional traps of thinking. And it culminates with thinking about yourself and thinking about others. And by this time in the practice, you should be pretty good. If you're in the warrior training section, you should be pretty good at having strategies of being present and cognitive attention training. So you're more aware of your thoughts as you think them. And you'll be able to see how many of your thoughts are just leading right back to you. And typically, anytime that we're thinking stuff about like Gene's political preferences, you know, Gene just doesn't understand. That's just Gene doesn't understand what I understand. So it's always just going to lead right back to self, right? Maybe not always. Maybe someday somebody's going to give me the example where thinking about another person didn't involve self. It's not going to happen very often. So it's not worth really considering the one anomaly out of 10 billion thoughts, right? And then we have this little thing that we call the event horizon. And I'm keeping consistent with this hydrostacy theme because you have that event horizon around a black hole or the ring of balance. And that's the point where we really start to feel the benefits of our practice. And that feeling is really starting to become preferred. It's like, I prefer to be more present. I prefer to be more sensual with the moment. I prefer the practice that's occurring and how it makes me feel. And at that point, I don't think that a person is going to quit very easily, because the mind is now starting to associate the practice to safety. Just like when I walk in Chicago, my mind almost reminds me of my practice now. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You're in Chicago. You need to pay attention to the world around you, not worry, but be cautiously aware. That's the balance. So oblivious and worried. In the middle is cautiously aware. So I like to think that I'm just being cautiously aware. Does that make sense so far? Okay, and then we start to get into the procedure of hydrostacy. So remember, foundational practice is forgetting almost all the time. And so we start to create strategies to come back to the present moment. The counterbalance phase is we're forgetting more than we're remembering, but we are remembering. We're doing our counterbalance technique. We're remembering the present moment. We're remembering our breath, our body, and our valid points of attention, because by this point, we do have some successful strategies, whatever your points of attention are. I have my successful ones. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't, but if you have yours, then that's what counts. And then we go into warrior training because we're starting to remember more than forget. So throughout the day, it's like, I really am practicing for most of the time until I get really hungry and then I get derailed or, something like that. And that's okay. That's a part of the practice. I really like that this practice doesn't expect a person to go from oblivious to the present moment to totally locked in all the time, because that's not very realistic. Does that make sense? And then we get into hydrostacy. Hydrostacy is the opposite of the foundational practice because it's starting to remember almost all of the time. And that means that we are redirecting and we're learning to maintain at least one point of attention throughout the day. Does that make sense? And then here is the simple procedure for hydrostacy, and then we'll talk about the Nemesis. We'll do a little bit of review of last week as well, so we can connect that to the Nemesis. But I don't know how, but I forgot how much I love the whiteboard. I really like the teaching. It's like I have a chalkboard in a classroom type of deal. It's kind of fun. Okay, so let's outline hydrostacy procedure, because this entire practice is all about technique. Technique is what helps us cross that bridge between theory and application. A lot of people have a lot of concepts, they have a lot of ideas, they have a lot of theories, they have a lot of words, but when you ask them, what is the substance, what is the mechanism, what are your techniques, it gets real quiet. We start to hear crickets. So the first technique of hydrostacy is what I call the 4 directions of attention. And I don't want this to sound insurmountable in the beginning. You don't need all 4. So in the beginning, you could just literally maintain one direction and you're good, right? Isn't that the goal, is just to maintain presence? Fine. So if Jerry is all day locked in and alternating, because situations throughout the day change, we segment throughout the day. But in general, if Jean were to drop out of the sky and say, Jerry, where's your mind now? She's going to be able to tell you a pre-established point of attention that has been intended in advance, but maybe it's been intended in advance for months and months now, because it's an OG technique. It's one that you're really used to, and it's a part of your 4 directions. So to review the 4 directions again, we have sensory perception, and that is what you would consider the outside world. So if you're locked in doing defocused vision, or maybe you're doing more of a focused meditation where you're looking at the flame on a candle and you really want to just totally focus in on one thing rather than all of your senses, hey, that's cool too. If you want to expand your bubble of perception, which is kind of expanding into the environment, and defocused vision really helps that. I find that this bubble of perception really lends to peripheral vision. You know, engaging peripheral vision, I am populating my bubble of perception. And so that's all the first direction. And these don't go in any particular order. It's which one do you want to activate of these 4 directions? Fine. And then the second direction is introspective attention. And this is using our peripheral nervous system to sense our body. And, you know, there may be other things going on, but just to avoid any rabbit holes, sometimes people get a little bit, I don't know, woo-woo, I guess that's one way to say it. This
What
whole
are you calling this one? I'm sorry.
introspective attention, the
Okay,
mind's
thanks.
ability to place its attention on its own physicality. So that would be body awareness. And that is a separate direction that, now the reason that the 4 directions is so clever, it's so beneficial, is because we can maintain all 4 at once, if we so choose. You don't have to, though. I think eventually the more you practice, you may find that you're just doing that anyway, that you're aware of your breath while you're doing defocused vision, and you're like, oh shoot, I do have two directions active. So sometimes it kind of just happens on its own. And then that brings up the third direction of attention, which is awareness on our breath. I can do peripheral vision while paying attention to my hand, I feel it, and breathing. My mind isn't alternating back and forth rapidly. I'm able to maintain all of those 3 directions at the exact same time. Does that make sense? And then a fun one that I really enjoy is cognition, and cognition minus thinking. That's a part of our cognition that we're not including in the 4 directions of attention necessarily. It can still be used, but to redirect back to the practice would be the main time that we want to use our thought, is to remind ourselves of our practice, what we're doing, and to redirect. Or if a really clever thought comes up, write that down and continue on with your practice. Or don't write it down, because if it is truly clever, I'm sure you'll think of it again. And if you don't, maybe the world just lost the most important aha sentence ever. So yeah, maybe write it down. The difference so there's not necessarily a difference, but the reason that these are being differentiated is because we can maintain attention on both. So if I pay attention to my hand, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with breathing, does it? Not necessarily. I don't have to pay attention to my breath while paying attention to my hand, but I can pay attention to both. So the directions of attention lend to simultaneous points of attention, because what Jean and I realized is that sometimes if we're doing 2 things in the same direction, our mind is actually rapidly going back and forth. There's a lot of emerging science that says the human mind isn't really multitasking. You're not really maintaining multiple things in your mind at once, but rather attention is just rapidly alternating between different things. Does that make sense?
Yes, I just wanted to know because when you introspective attention, and then you also said body awareness. So then when you said awareness on breathing, I just wondered why awareness on breathing was highlighted, even though it's an action of body awareness in a sense, but you gave it a special category. So I just wondered, was there any other particular reason why awareness of breath was important that you wanted to,
Right. And so the main reason is because it can be maintained simultaneously.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that, you're not rapidly going back and forth. I can pay attention to my feet independently of my breath, or I can put the 2 together. I can also pay attention to my breath independently of my feet or my hands or my dantian. Actually, dantian's a little bit difficult because that's where the breath is coming from. So those two tend to blend together. But yeah, so that would be the difference for the differentiation, is to highlight the aspect that we can have multiple points of attention at the same time. And then that 4th direction of attention are different forms of cognition. And it's not tricky when you really start to do it. but imagination is usually a really low-hanging fruit. So to be able to, so I'm aware of my bubble of perception. That's the outside direction. I'm aware of my body and space and time. Maybe I'm paying attention to how my feet are rolling on the sidewalk. That's a popular thing in Tai Chi walking, is you're paying attention to the foot as it's moving across the ground. And then I'm breathing, I add the breath to that. Now I have 3 points of attention. And then I imagine my bone density increasing with each step. Or I imagine a dragon or whatever it is. And I recommend it. It's like superimposed imagination. But ultimately what we want to engage are eventually what I'll outline as the virtues of the evolution of consciousness, or the results of the evolved human mind, such as humor, such as logic, reason, deduction, those types of things. Does that make sense? And I do admit that the cognition one will probably be the trickiest. And for me, it was easy when I did it with imagination. And in fact, there's a certain point where I will recommend using your imagination, because as human beings, imagination falls to the wayside. And it's actually one of the most important aspects of human creativity and the evolution of the mind, is to engage these things. Beauty, for example, when you find something beautiful, you don't necessarily need to think about that, do you? You can look at a sunset and have absolutely no thought in your mind, and you're still, beauty is one of the aspects. Recognizing what we view as beautiful is an aspect of the evolved mind that has absolutely nothing to do with physical evolution. Gene finding a sunset beautiful really didn't help him defend the village against a bear. Unless the bear is just like, yes, it is beautiful, and sits down next to him and has a beer. But that's probably not happening. Although there's a movie called Cocaine Bear, where the bear takes a bunch of cocaine and just goes on a rampage. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's one of those B-type movies, but I saw a preview and I was laughing a little bit. So I'll get to your question, Donna. Let me outline just a couple more cognition, because that one is a little bit tricky for people. So we recognize beauty, that's one. Recognizing geometrical shapes, that's our mind's ability to recognize geometry. So that's not necessarily associated to safety all the time, although that could be to a certain extent. But it's another aspect of the human mind that isn't necessarily using thought. So it can exist independently from thought. So it's another aspect of our cognition. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so there are lots of different ways to interact. Humor can be a little bit tricky because we're used to jokes, which involve words. But there are other ways to find humor. You know, whenever I look at the pigeons and the way they interact with one another, I can't help but giggle internally. So really what we're looking to do with the cognition aspect is to embrace these elements of the human condition that just don't get enough emphasis throughout the day. Appreciation is one of my favorites. So I'm putting my mind on appreciation. That doesn't need thought. But we would agree that that is an aspect of cognition, is appreciation, the ability to appreciate. And then eventually we'll have different emotions and things like that that are occurring. And we could just put that in the cognition category for now. We don't have to get too technical with things. It's about working with it. Yes, William, did you have a question?
Yes, so cognition, we're just saying, in a sense, we're looking at cognition as sensation. It's something. I'm trying to think of cognition without thought. That's why I guess what we're pointing out here is that cognition is the ability to recognize something, but without thinking. Like we use the example of a sunset or a beautiful, something that you see that's beautiful. It's something that you recognize, but it's not something that you have to give a lot of thought to or create thought forms in your mind around words around necessarily.
Bingo. Yeah.
That's cognition. And it's interesting because I know the word cognition, of course, but I don't associate it with not thought. But I understand it can be without thought.
Right. And then on the flip side of that, a lot of people, when they're talking about other forms of cognition, they use the word thought. I've heard Buddhist monks tell you that you just need to think about the sunset. And it's like, wait a second, we're using our words interchangeably and then they don't make any sense. So when I use the word thought, that fundamentally involves language. It could even,
Okay.
it could
But that
include,
would, in the Buddhist monk example, that could be, that word thought could have at that moment been really imagination.
it could have been,
Imagine.
exactly. Yep. It was very likely not being associated to word-based streams.
Word based on it.
Yeah. So they'll say, well, you just really have to think about it. And it's, but they're not necessarily meaning words. So I have,
That's why I like imagination. I understand
yep,
imagination is you imagine generally with imagery. I mean, you
generally,
create images, and then those images though do have feelings and emotions that may be associated with them.
absolutely.
But the imagination part is so ingrained in you that you don't necessarily need the words. You just
Exactly.
got it.
Yep. And then I like to use that old school example that if you're walking down a path and you see a tree has fallen, you can logically deduce that you have to go around, under, over, or through, and you can come to a creative, elegant solution, all without words occurring. They probably will occur for most people, but they are not necessary. You can have all of that other stuff without word-based verbal cognition in your mind. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Donna, did you have a point to add or a question with that?
It was right along the lines what William was saying.
Okay.
So it kind of answered my question. For me, I don't know if this is correct or it's veering off of what you're saying, but recognition and appreciation without a lot of words. Sometimes there's words, but they're very few, if any. The tree that's fallen, you don't have to tell the narration of the tree has fallen. I wonder why it fell. It must have been the wind. You may make those kinds of observations, but you don't need all the words to them. And you might even appreciate looking at such a thing from a different perspective. Like I never noticed this about a tree without the words. You're just recognizing something. And a question I was going to ask, but you kind of answered it, is similarities and anomalies. I found that going from warrior training towards hydrostacy, that was the kind of, I noticed the principles and things a lot. And then the words started to, because there's a lot of words associated with noticing the principles of things. And I didn't need them all. And then noticing similarities and anomalies about, I don't know, the human condition or the momentum when people have habits or societies do or cultures do, or how, I don't know, media influences decisions. It's just an observation that would require a lot of words to discuss. Like you were saying, learning occurs. The learning is something I kind of see in hindsight. I can regurgitate the learning, but it requires a lot of words to explain it. It only took a moment really, or a moment or two to observe it, or a walking through an experience to recognize it. But there's very few words associated with it.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Is that what, am I talking about the same thing?
Yep.
Okay.
And then eventually the words can just become few and far between, right? Okay, now we talked about the 4 directions, and so we have all 4 of our directions listed. So the 4 directions of attention will consist of sensory attention training. So we're able to pay attention to our senses of our outside environment. Introspection, that's our body, breath, and cognition. And cognition. And a great imaginary exercise is to imagine all of my misspelling as correct. So that's the homework. Now, what I recommend when we start hydrostacy is to maintain at least 1 point of attention At this point, you're ready for this. So it's not a recommendation per se, but you'll be maintaining at least one direction at all times, all throughout the day. So there's not a lot of coming back to the moment because you never left. And then 2, we combine the 4 directions of attention with the 4 modes practice informally. Eventually, I will get into formal practices, but that's not quite yet. So the 4 modes practice is now you are doing your 4 directions every time you're moving, every time you're standing, every time you're laying down, and every time you're sitting, and then the transitions between them. That's the 4 modes practice. Yeah. So that equals all of the time. We covered all of our bases there. So we have the 4 directions of attention coupled with an informal 4 modes practice. You have sat down at the desk. Let's sense into our point of attention, and multiple if you're able. Sometimes if you're doing certain types of work, then your cognition, you're reading something. So that is your cognition right now, and that's okay. So it's not, again, I don't prescribe to opposite extremes. I think that's wildly erroneous, and it's all over the world that, oh, you're thinking too much, go to not thinking. Oh, you're super egotistical, cessate the ego, dissolve the ego. And it's like, you guys are just going from one extreme to another, and I'm calling bullshit because I don't see it. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's not my goal though. So here we are just finding balance with things. So if you need to read, read. If you want to think about something, think about something. Do it intentionally with volition and will. Make it an act of recognized desire to intention to will. And then we have that first little triangle that we talked about on Thursday, which I won't get into because then we'll be talking about this the whole time. Shana, may I have a coffee refill if you have a second? She does have a second. Excellent. Okay, so we have the 4 directions of attention coupled with the 4 modes practice. And this will equal the drum roll of space in the mind. We will actually be creating gaps in the overall amount of cognition, and it will gradually start to reduce the more we do this practice. And now we're ready for one of the most important elements of hydrostacy, and that is, and this will also be a topic when we get into the 20 topics. This will eventually be one of them, of course. Just imagine that engaging spelled correctly. I don't know. I come from the era of spell check. So here we are. I can't spell very well. I am learning. It is getting better, but engaging the space. So if you are creating gaps in the overall amount of cognition, word-based cognition in your mind, you will feel that. There's a feeling associated with it. You can't go from thinking 98% of the day to 30 and not notice. Like it's noticeable. Specifically, you can feel it in your forehead, in your temples. This area feels like clouds have been pushed aside, and all of a sudden the sunshine can get through. Whoa, that's a great analogy. I'm going to write that down. I like that. That's a good one. So does that, and now that, what'd you say, Shana?
It's on the spot.
On the spot. I do it, yeah. So we have created the space in the cognition that can become the cognitive point of attention now. Along with imagination, if you want to, that would be kind of going back and forth between the two. So you can alternate how you see fit. But when you create that space in your forehead area, when the thought has actually been given some space, you can feel that, and you can now engage that feeling. And Donna, what happens when we engage that feeling? Only one thing. It grows, it gets bigger. Yeah. So once that space is there, you start to engage it, it starts to happen more often. You start to feel it more throughout your day. You can be in almost any situation and you're able to clear your mind, engage the space, and there you are. Does that make sense? At least conceptually, does it make sense? It might be, we still might need some time and some practice before we're able to really sense into these feelings, because this is a conditional. It's a conditional sensation. However, again, some people are so hung up on conditional feedback that they want to go to the opposite extreme and say everything is unconditional. Stop. You don't know what it's like to win the Super Bowl. That's a conditional feeling. Like, you got to actually win the Super Bowl to know what it feels like to win the Super Bowl. And then maybe after you do, you can recreate that. I doubt it, but maybe you can. I don't know. That's not I don't know. So this is a conditional feeling. You have to create space in the mind in order to feel this. If you're just thinking, you can't feel this feeling simultaneously with thought. Does that make sense? They exist independently from one another. And imagination can bring you right back to it. You're right. Imagination can be that cognition point of attention that helps to push the clouds away, so the sun can shine through. I like that a lot. Okay. And now that sets up the opportunity for two more of our techniques, which is determining how you want to feel and sensing into the moment, the essence of the moment. Who likes poetry? Does anybody like poetry? I think it's okay. Because most of it I don't. Sometimes I just don't understand it. But some poetry I really do. I told you guys, I don't really like Shakespeare. It's really hard for me to connect with Shakespeare because the words I don't know what the hell he's talking about, and this isn't how people talk, and I just don't care for it. I'm sure it's beautiful to many minds, but it's not to me. It's just like, meh, can we just translate this into words I use? That'd be like listening to a poem in French. It sounds nice, but I have no idea what you just said. But poetry is really lending to the essence. When we have paintings and things, they're trying to capture the essence of the moment. When I write in my books, I want to capture the essence and convey it through words so that other people can feel that essence that we're trying to convey. Does that make sense? It's not woo-woo. We're still not in woo-woo land with any of this. And I have techniques around that. We'll talk about those next time. We'll talk about the techniques that we can use to find a particular state that we desire. I call it emotional memory. And spoiler alert, I start with appreciation. That's the first one. That's the easiest to go to because I'm alive. Shit might not be going my way today. I walked outside and it's a snowy, wet, slippery mess and I forgot my gloves and scarf. But I'm okay because I'm alive. And I have this opportunity to exist so I can feel a baseline of appreciation and therefore a baseline of contentment. And according to our man Tick, then it is happiness. Happiness is contentment. Contentment is happiness in the way that he used the word. And I'm down with that definition. So I'm good with that. So I can be happy and miserable physically at the same time. Isn't that weird? Okay. Then I have a technique, and I'll just foreshadow a little bit. I populate the bubble of perception with as much detail as I can. It's not long before the essence of the moment is screaming at you because you're paying attention to all the detail. Does that make sense? And there are ways to just look at something, especially if you've never seen it before. Like if you see massive trees for the first time and your breath is kind of just taken away, you just had a direct connection with the essence of it. And the mind was a little bit blown away because it likes new. So put those two things together. All right. And we won't talk about the sixth technique because that comes a little bit further down the road with hydrostacy, adaptation to change, or the act of alignment. But it is also procedural. So there are things that we can do, like when Jean wasn't feeling well, when I walk outside and I forgot my scarf and gloves. Adaptation becomes technique-based. So I don't box. I've never really done boxing before. But if I were to meet William and do boxing with this mindset, then I could go through pain better than if I were lost in thoughts and resistance to any amount of pain. People who have a lot of thought and resistance, they tend to not be able to do things that require physical exertion because they're thinking about it too much. They give up too quickly. They can't find the underlying appreciation with the physical discomfort, because physical discomfort could be a step towards a larger goal. And so put your attention on the larger goal. Intention and will come into alignment. Do your legs feel better while you're holding that stance? No, they don't feel any better. It still hurts. However, I'm not lost in thought. I'm not resisting the moment. I know that this is temporary. I know that this is for a larger goal. And so typically with that mindset, you can endure a little bit more physical discomfort. And then eventually with a lot of practice, potentially you can endure a lot of physical discomfort. And then you're like Wim Hof and you're climbing a mountain in your underwear, whatever. If you find that type of thing exhilarating, I don't know. I don't think anybody else would appreciate me climbing a mountain in my underwear. So yeah, I'm not going to do that to the people. Okay, all that makes sense. So that's kind of an introduction to the final phase, the final layer of the practice. I am going to get to the point where I offer a wide variety of physical practices. And then we'll start to do the 4 modes in a more formal way. So I will offer moving meditation, movement stuff, sitting stuff, laying down stuff, and standing stuff. So standing, moving, laying down, and I'm forgetting one, but you know the 4.
Sitting.
Yes.
And transitions between.
And transitions between. So transitions between are important to a certain extent with formal, but you spend more time formally in like the standing posture. But still, we don't want to go from a standing meditation to, oh, I'm glad that's done. No, we do our formal standing and then we do a little bit of transition back into, all right, let's start moving. So there are those transitions. Not as much as in informal though. In informal, your whole day is full of transitions. Like, does that make sense? That's a little bit of a difference, but it's also the same.
It was a big deal for me in warrior training.
Yes, big difference for sure.
I was saying that yoga is, certain forms of yoga involve the transitions from one pose to another.
Yeah,
It's a significant part of that.
it is. Okay, so last week I broke down the plight of the human species, that at some point we got to the top of the food chain and we took everything that we had used up to that point and we just imploded. The violence and the aspects of the human mind that very likely helped keep us safe, you know, there was a point in time, Gene, where we couldn't walk up to the bear and reason with it. You know, they just didn't reason and logic. That stuff didn't work. We didn't really have our fences built yet. So, Gene, you have to wrestle the bear. So you probably need a certain amount of aggression to wrestle the bear, right? A certain amount. Yeah, but
You can wrestle it once, yeah.
you can wrestle it once. So the idea is that at a certain point in human history, we started to evolve cognitively because a lot of our conditions, our needs were met. We were able to build houses and that kept us warm and sheltered. We were able to dig wells and that's where we got all of our water. We were able to farm and hunt and that's where we get all of our food. And then we're able to have other people produce some of our food while other people produce some of our other goods and services. And then before you know it, we have a society. And that's all great. You know, again, people love going from one extreme to another. They're totally immersed in society and then they're ready to go off the grid. I will live totally by myself. And it's like, okay, good luck with going to an opposite extreme, expecting it to be better when nothing here has ever really changed. I'll be here when you get back, if you make it back. I saw that thing. It's like, why can't I just sit on the beach all day long? That's my whole life. And I'm like, because it will kill you. Like, these are great ideas until you need to survive. And then all of a sudden you realize you don't know how to start a fire. You don't know how to build shelter and you're pretty much screwed. But yeah, you don't have a job. So go have fun. Okay. So essentially in the plight of the human condition, I don't remember what I called that. I have it written down somewhere, what I called last week's class. But it starts at the very beginning. So the reason that we're in the condition that we're in is that at some point the human mind got lost in thought. And that wasn't all the time in our history. There were plenty of times throughout history where human beings were able to engage the moment and not be completely lost in thought. We are so far away from that. Our society today, with the internet, with our abilities to communicate, with just the way that people are interacting with their lives, competing, and we talked a little bit about the destroyers on Thursday. We talked about the first enemy of knowledge, which is distraction up to the present moment. This all has taken off like a runaway freight train in our world today. So on average, the average human being is not engaging the world around them, not on any significant degree. Maybe they're doing it for 15 or 20 minutes during meditation, a couple hours during physical practices, maybe accidentally in areas of specialty that they're really good. But in general, the plight of the human condition is because we have gotten completely lost in thought. William, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
I was just when you said that, I think that's even why this work is even more critically. I mean, that's always been important for everybody at any point in time, but I just think currently now, with all of the amount of thought material that's being pushed, it's even more critical that people be able to make space in their because that's what's happening. People are taking up more space in other people's minds, and so
Yes.
you know it's very critical that we be able to create space. And I think that's just something that is not quite something that's understood, that you can make space. And I think that's just with all, that's one of my biggest things. Like I realize how much more thought is being produced and how it's
Yeah.
not healthy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in our world today, we see so much clinging and attaching to one side of things or one perspective. That's the opposite of critical thinking. Critical thinking is the ability to look at a subject, any subject, objectively without drawing rash conclusions so that you can get a more broad perspective. Let's say Jean is from a completely different part of the world as Donna, and they have completely different viewpoints on eating meat, for example. I pulled that one out of thin air. Well, if I'm a critical thinker, I'm going to listen to Jean and I'm going to listen to Donna, and I'm not necessarily going to form my own opinion. I'm just going to recognize that they have two opposite but valid points of argument or, opinions on eating meat. Maybe Jean's village lives off of one whale. They kill a whale. That is their way of life. They do everything with it. They don't waste an ounce of the meat, but Donna's a vegan. Right? So they're going to have their own perspectives and both of them are valid. It requires space to listen. It requires space, Gene, to collect the data. If we're just clinging and attaching to our own stream of thought, I can't really hear you. I can't really hear Donna. The Democrat can't hear the Republican when they're just entertaining their own thought, and then when they're trying to convince somebody and control their mind. Most of the time when people are discussing these types of things, they're not critical thinkers that are trying to broaden their horizons. Not usually. This does occur, because some people are critical thinkers, but not often. It's usually, I'm just going to pretend to listen to Gene so that I can show him how everything he's saying is stupid and wrong. And I'll do it very subtly. I'll be like, yeah, Gene, that's nice, but it's also stupid and wrong. Does that make sense? So right on with what William was mentioning, that if we want to be critical, if critical thinkers, objective, we want to listen to other people, we want to grow, we want to learn, we want to pay attention to our environment. It is a skill. You're exactly right. We have to practice. And the more that we practice, we can get better. You're absolutely right. I do think, though, that there will be a world, hopefully, where this isn't as difficult to practice. These things aren't as difficult because they are already more present. They're already more environmentally connected, those types of things. Does that make sense?
I think that the critical thinking is allowed to exist when we do this practice.
Yes.
I just had a conversation with Ida about this very thing. I happened to be crocheting and I watched for Bali something on television that was Harry and Meghan or whatever. And I just saw the anomalies and similarities about this experience they were talking about they were having from their perspective, which was very, very different than a lot of the Commonwealth sees them as. And I was just curious what Ida thought her perception was based on what the media was and the people around her and how they felt about them. And I expected her to say what she said, which was, in her world, with her influence in and being under the monarchy for so long, they have a different perspective than we do here in this country, and how the media influences it and whatever. Once again, it would take a lot more words to describe what I was observing than, and it was a consistencies and anomalies to what's happening politically, what's happening across the globe, like the dynamic of human nature and what happens when you're not practicing, and when there's othering and all of the stuff that we talk about becomes just so clear. It seemed to me, it just became so clear, and everyone has their own perspective based on the totality of their understanding at that moment and their lack of practicing presence and using their own critical mind to just listen, just to observe and listen, can only happen when this is relaxed, and that's just not common.
It's not. You're absolutely right. And I don't want to create a us versus them, but if I talk about it statistically, if I talk about it with numbers and arithmetic, it will create a differentiation. We'll be using different equations. So now we get to kind of what my topic is today on the nemesis. So we already know that the human species is lost in thought. They're labeling, judging, comparing, contrasting, trying to figure things out, going from one extreme to the other, replacing thought, going from one type of thinking to a new type of thinking, thinking that the new thinking is somehow better and, you know, it's top-notch thinking. And then before you know it, it leaks into everything. And now you have these spiritual groups. They're like, Gene is low vibrational today. And it's like, what? Like, what are we talking about? And so it's creating levels and separation. And, you know, you can use the word Jesus or you can use the word universe. At a certain point, people are saying the exact same thing. You have to have faith in the universe. The universe has a plan. And it's like, this is exactly, and I'm not saying that's true or false or plus or minus. It's just awfully similar to everything else. We're just replacing the word, the deity figure, with universe. That's okay. I'm just noticing a consistency versus an anomaly. It is what it is. And I don't think it's good or bad. I don't really care. But it is an example of going from one type of thinking to a new type of thinking, thinking that the new thinking is somehow better thinking. And you're still just thinking all the time. So I don't really view that as actual change. So the world has fallen into a modality of existence. And when we talk about the enemies of knowledge, the first enemy is distraction, the distracted mind. But distracted from what? The moment at hand. So back in the day when Gene had to hunt the bear, if he was thinking about this and that and the other thing, and he was in emotional turmoil because Donna called him stupid yesterday, and he knows he's not stupid, and that's just, he didn't hear the bear come up behind him. He didn't notice that the bear was about to attack him until he was on the ground, because he became dumb, deaf, and blind to the world around him. That couldn't happen with our species at a certain point in our history. We had to be perennially aware of our environment. We had to pay attention to the sky so that we knew what kind of weather was on its way for our crops. We had to pay attention to the finest details. So when you hear tales or you talk to somebody who has closer ties to indigenous people, it almost seems like they have extrasensory perception. You know, their ability to run through a forest and you never know that they're there. Their ability to camp, and then when they're done, you had no idea. Of course, the animals know because you can't fool them, but you can fool other people because there's almost no trace. They don't destroy everything in the process. They don't cut down 1 million trees to build, 5 sheets of paper. They utilize all of their senses. They're really utilizing and engaging their senses because they did this by default. to a certain extent, because it was necessary for survival. So the brain valued it. The brain is like, oh, Gene, you better pay attention because you're out hunting bears, or they're hunting
How
you.
did we know, how did we learn to not run from a bear and to stand still? And that became, that was not just trial and error, because otherwise there'd just be a lot of dead people. If
Right.
somebody was paying attention to how a bear responds and what they do, and that could only happen when your mind is available to
Mhm.
consume that information, which means
Right.
probably out hunting or quiet in the woods.
Yep. And then, maybe we're all together and Jerry ran from the bear and we noticed that the bear followed her, not us. And so we're like, maybe you just shouldn't run unless it's a grizzly bear, because you're done. Like if you run, you're done. If you don't run, you're done. You really gotta just hope that the grizzly bear is not interested. So maybe curling up in a fetal position and covering yourself with leaves is the best, the best thing with a grizzly bear, because they can be pretty ferocious. Okay, so the nemesis is the mind that is operating below the level of conscious recognition. And the distracted mind lends to this. So if Gene was walking down the street, looking at a cell phone, listening to music, thinking about what he's going to do next Tuesday, he is operating. He is literally operating in the world below the level of recognition. If I said, Gene, what were you thinking? He would have to pause and be like, well, oh, I was thinking about this. Gene, what were you listening to? I was listening to, there's a delay, a gap, because it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't specific. And Carly, who, she can't make it to some of our groups, but she sent me a video by Joe Dispenza. And it's essentially all the things that I've talked about, and it's fine. I thought it was an okay video. I had no opinion either way. But what Joe Dispenza's video pointed out is that the human being gets into closed feedback loops that we call habit. And again, I don't declare war on habit. I don't see a single human being without a habit, because the mind does that. It's wired to do that. It's wired to create these things to make certain aspects of our life easier so that it can spend more of its energy on keeping us safe and not trying to remember how to open a can of beans. So it will use memory and a little bit of habitual nature, a closed feedback loop, to help things become a little bit easier. However, if we're always operating below the level of recognition, the closed feedback loops get deeper. They get more ingrained. They start to lend to other closed feedback loops. And before you know it, from the time that we wake up, from the time that we go to bed, our entire day is a habitual hot mess. Does that make sense? The habits are getting out of balance. Whether that is competing socially, I want to wear the nicest clothes and I'll go to the gym to make sure I have calves and glutes of steel, to constantly engaging in the endless human mating rituals. The why do you need glutes of steel? You're not a fireman. Like, you work at a desk all day. You're doing that because you want somebody to see it. You want somebody to appreciate your glutes for whatever reason. Because you can't even see your glutes. So don't tell me you like them. You can't even see it yourself. So if you're building that muscle, very likely. And then, so I'll flip it over. These are some of the results of the nemesis, Jerry. So I'll define the nemesis on my whiteboard, and I've been saving my whiteboard. Nemesis, I-S or E-S? I-S, I think it's I-S. Mm-hmm. And this is usually the only time I'll use the word level, because the level is binary, above or below. Now, an interesting thing, whoops, I didn't mean to stop sharing, is that the mind is wired to do this. So it's only the nemesis because it's way out of balance. So I'm going to create what I call the bubble of perception. Okay. In the center of the bubble of perception is the human mind. Now, the human mind is aware of its environment, and I'm going to make arrows that go outside the circle are below the level of recognition, arrows inside the circle are above the level of recognition, meaning that we're aware of it as it's occurring. The mind is aware of its environment below the level of recognition at all times. That's where reflexes come from. That's why we have proprioception, because our mind is both aware below and above the level of recognition. Naturally. Naturally above and below. So the dynamic, oh, that just went right through the lines. Okay. So the dynamic itself, again, like most dynamics, it's not evil. It's not bad. So Gene is in a room right now. His mind is aware of more than he is currently recognizing. Attention is the mind's ability to isolate aspects of its available data. There's a lot of available data, and there's even data that is being inputted without him knowing it, such as temperature potentially. Maybe he's not really aware of the temperature until he puts his attention on the temperature. Now it's above the level of recognition, but his body is still aware of the temperature. Does that make sense? So that's great. Like, that's an amazing aspect of our mind and our ability to interact with our environment. So it's a lot like breath. Breath can be above and below the level of recognition. That's great, you know, because if I'm not aware of my breath, I don't want to just die. So I'm really glad that my breath can go below the level of recognition at times. I'm okay with that. It's also an excellent anchor of attention. I'm okay with that too. But if Gene is running away from the bear and his focus becomes that ebb and flow state, you know, where he just goes into no thinking and just do energy, he might not be counting his breaths. He might just be running faster than he's ever ran before up a tree. You see what I mean? And that's okay. So it's okay for the mind to go below the level of recognition. The nemesis is the imbalance of the human being existing below the level of recognition for almost their entire life. And that feeds what I call the fifth destroyer, which is the collective momentum of humanity. The human species has a collective momentum. You can feel it going this direction or that direction to a certain extent. So the nemesis is being fed whenever we are just operating on habit, conditioning, routine. Routine can be a very powerful thing. So if Gene is going to sit down and he's going to do something in a particular way with attention and awareness and volition and desire and will and intention, that could be a very powerful routine. And then again, that routine over time could become habit if he starts to check out. Does that make sense? And so the human condition on average is going through their entire day, months, years, decades of accumulated operating below the level of recognition, just operating on habit. And what happens when this occurs? All of a sudden, everyday life is so important. The little aspects of everyday life is getting all of our cognition. And we know, at least if you've read my books, that death will advise you. You know, we think that all of these little things are so important. You know, Donna didn't get her package in the mail, and, you know, maybe Michael has a meeting, or always give Michael the meeting example or the trucker example. That's not fair. I need to come up with more examples for Michael. I usually use people that have their cameras on as my examples. And I think that's why Michael turned his camera off. There was a time where he had his camera on, clicked it off because he kept getting used as an example. But my examples are benign. I promise I don't mean offense. So usually I try to make them so outlandish that you know it's not a personal attack. But these things that we think are so important, you know, oh, I'm not going to get my yada yada done by my deadline, or just whatever. I, like Donna said, I'm getting bad at acting these things out because I just don't have these problems, you could say. But the mundane aspects of everyday life start to become heavy. They start to weigh us down, and our energy isn't able to move. It's not able to thrive. And what happens? We get sick. As human beings, the entire human species is sick on a most level. We're getting sicknesses that just shouldn't be there if we weren't involved in these closed feedback loops and patterns. To-do lists, I'm sure that's one of them. Yeah. All of these little mundane concerns of everyday life, they get our cognition, they get our worry. And then before you know it, we have no emotional intelligence. We're all over the place emotionally. We're highly reactive. What did you just say, Gene? I know you didn't just talk about the color of my shirt. Look at yours. And now we're going back and forth, and we're getting mad at each other, and we're judging each other, and we're comparing, and we're contrasting, and now we're trying to figure everything out with words. Like, with words, I am going to hear that one sentence. Finally, I've heard the one sentence that just brings it all together, and I can just sit back and relax and be enlightened. I call bullshit. That's why those stories, and upon hearing it, he became enlightened. Stop. All due respect to those Buddha stories, stop. And he became enlightened. He heard that one thing, and it's just like, put it all together. So does that make sense so far? The Nemesis. So based on what we've said so far, what's the solution? I have described a challenge for the human condition. What do you think a solution to this challenge would be? Logically.
Keep attention above the level of words.
Bingo. Keep our attention for as often as we can throughout the day above the level of recognition. Our mind is still going to create habits, but we'll see them before they get out of balance. We'll feel them before they have the that's the hydrostatic effect. We're able to feel our balance that, this thing that I've been doing, I didn't quite recognize it before, but now I see it now. It's entered into my field of perception, and I'm going to slow down on the donuts. I've been having a little too many donuts. So I'm going to go ahead and I can have donuts again. I'm not going to declare war on donuts, but I'm going to go ahead and pass. And then when we get down the road, I do have techniques for behavioral change. So I'll discuss all of those techniques on ways to interact with behavioral change as well. Only when there's space, though. Otherwise, a person's just going to create more resistance, trying to control, and then very likely leaking power over behavioral change. So does that make sense so far? So the Nemesis is the mind that is habitually stuck operating below the level of recognition. Have you ever noticed that the things that we do that require pristine attention, we love? Like anything that we can do, sports, for example. Who loves playing a sport? No matter what it is, whether it's tennis, golf, boxing, Tai Chi, whatever it is. Tai Chi's quasi-sport, let's be honest. The heart rate doesn't always get up. It can, just depends on how you do it. But so why do we love these sports so much? Because it's an opportunity to operate above the level of recognition and maybe even catch some of that just do energy, which is above the level of recognition. I don't like calling it flow anymore because we all know that's a buzzword. Find more flow on the go. And it's like, okay, now we're rhyming our buzzwords. Way to get it ingrained in my brain. Which is, yeah.
That statement, rise above the level of recognition. Would you say that in a beginner way? Say it a different way. I'm hearing it, but if you would please say it a different way for me. Sure.
Above the level of recognition is a mind that is deliberately intending the direction of its attention. So the moment that your attention is aligned with your intention and vice versa, you are above the level of recognition. You're paying attention. You're giving your attention to. So when you have the deliberate nature of attention, that is above the level of recognition. When you are not...
I'm hearing the words And I'm not trying to discount what you're saying is not true. My mind is having a hard time because I think this is going to be important for me to get. When I think recognition, I think I've recognized. I've recognition is recognizing something. So if you want me to go above that level of recognition, then you want me to go above.
No.
I see it's not working for me.
Right. Okay. So it's not really a level. So we are either above or below. There's no in between. If anything, no, there's no in between. I was gonna say maybe that is the buzzword of flow state. But so here we have habit. I would say autonomous, but let's just say habit or automatic. Right? Do you understand that one, Jerry? Habit, doing things
Yes,
automatically.
yes.
And then we have intention, intentional, willful, on purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You are either one of these two at all times. And sometimes you're a combination of the two. Because like I said, your mind is this circle where you're engaging the world around you both below the level of conscious recognition. So if you could substitute consciously aware with recognition. So if you're aware of something, you have recognized it and it has come into your field of attention. Does that make sense? So let's say that
So how does going above the level of recognition
you don't
help
go
me?
above it. You just go above this line. So you are either in recognition or below recognition.
Inside and
So when
outside
you said,
might be clearer.
What's that? Inside recognition.
Inside the bubble of perception, you're aware, or you're outside the bubble of perception. I'm making my cup of coffee. I can make an entire cup of coffee by thinking of something else, of making my to-do list, of being annoyed at the neighbor's volume about whatever. And making my coffee is within my bubble of perception, but my recognition on it can be inside the bubble of recognition, inside the bubble of perception or outside of it. I have that bubble of data, and I'm either recognizing the data inside the bubble, or my mind is outside of the bubble. I made an entire pot of coffee without noticing the temperature, the texture, the smell, they were within the bubble of available data, but I didn't have any recognition of any of it.
Right.
so I was taking it too literally when I
think
thought
you were.
I heard Gene or somebody say going to the level.
Right.
I don't even know what it was now.
Well, I think what you were saying is that like we were creating a thing that is beyond conscious recognition, above that. And no, I don't.
Well, I mean, that's what it sounded like. Maybe I I thought that's what Gene said, something about going beyond the level of recognition. So you want me to go somewhere?
No. We don't want you to go anywhere. So
we have to agree on what recognition means.
Right.
First.
And okay, so here is a really this could be an applicable example that you can apply. So what is the definition of attention? I've already said it today. What am I using? How do I define attention itself?
Deliberate.
Not necessarily. No, attention's not always deliberate. If you're not in a dreamless sleep, your attention is active.
You said the attention is ability to isolate data or information.
Absolutely. And that can be below purpose or on purpose. Does that make sense? So if you're paying attention to your thought out of habit, there is no volition, there is no will, there is no deliberate nature. That is, some people would just say, Jerry, that's an unconscious thing. You're either conscious or unconscious. I don't like using that because if you get knocked out, now you're unconscious. So we're using our words in different ways. So I use recognition. Does that make sense? So the definition of attention that William pointed out is the mind's ability to isolate aspects of its available sensory data. It's doing that all the time. All the time. Whether you're lost in thought, whether you're lost in a habit, you're still paying attention to it. It's below the level of on purpose. It's not on purpose. Does that make sense? Now, the moment that, let's say on William's list of things to pay attention to are, I don't know, the shadows on the walls in the room that he's in. He's chosen to look at the shadows for no other reason than the mind isn't habitually used to doing it. That's the only thing it needs to be a valid point of attention. If it makes him feel good, fine. I guess that's good too, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It just needs to be not a habit. So the moment he shines the flashlight of his attention where he wants it to be on purpose, he has just risen above this little line, and he is now in volition, will, deliberate nature, and conscious recognition of the moment on purpose, the opposite of the nemesis. The nemesis is attention that is operating below that threshold in habit. Does that make sense? Jerry, is that starting to click?
Yes, I'm listening.
Okay. Yeah, good question. We don't go, there is no beyond deliberate attention. It's either deliberate or it's not. That's a binary factor. Maybe when our brain is no longer able to sustain consciousness and our body no longer able to sustain our life force, we go beyond something. But until then, it's either one or the other. We're either in habit and we're driving to work and we're not even paying attention to any of the drive. We didn't pay attention to any of the cars. We were highly reactive when someone cut us off. We were thinking about this, thinking about that, thinking about the other thing, and looking at our cell phone while we're driving, doing all of those different things, answering our text messages because they're so important. We think things are so important when we're below that level of recognition, of conscious recognition, deliberate recognition. Does that make sense? And so the voice of power is words above the level of conscious recognition. You're choosing to do that. Your attention is deliberately on the words that you're using to direct you back to the present moment or to remind you of your practice or even to talk your practice out. That can be super beneficial. When I'm walking, sometimes I'll talk out my 4 directions. I'll remind myself of what I'm doing. My first direction is my bubble of perception. Oh, there it is. And my second is my whole body. Oh, I feel that. And then my third is my breath. I feel that going in and out. So I'm aware of the 3 chambers of breath. Does that make sense?
That description makes sense, and it's the one that I use. And you said it to Gene before. Gene's in his room and he has a bubble of a perception, but his awareness may or may not be on the available data in that room. That's the same as above and below. Is it within my bubble of perception or is it outside? Is my mind, is my attention somewhere outside the available data of this moment? Or is my attention engaged in something in the available
Yeah.
attention of my bubble of perception in this moment?
I see. So according to what Donna is saying, the future and the past is outside of your bubble of perception. Like there is no such thing as future and past in the room that you're in, right? It's always present. It's always happening now. So, but behind Gene right now is his bubble of perception. It's just not a part. He's not shining the light on it right now because it's behind him. Unless he chooses to, and then he could like use his imagination. He knows it's back there. He can kind of listen, and then if something falls off the shelf, it fell into his bubble of recognition, his little circle, like a flashlight shining inside that bubble of perception. And so the nemesis, just clearly put, is a mind where attention is habitual. The attention is, why do you need to look at your cell phone every 13 seconds?
Why do I need to review my to-do list every 13 seconds?
Every 13
I
seconds.
made a list, it's in my pocket. If I start to feel the pull towards, I have so many things to do today, then I go, here's my bubble of perception. I can feel there's that note in my pocket. When I need it, I can look at it and then go forward. Here's my feet on the floor, here's my breath, here's my whatever.
Why do I need to keep thinking about my goals? Why do I need to keep thinking about my desires? I already know what I desire. I already know my goal. I already know what I want. I already know how to do it. What the hell are we thinking about? It's just a habit. It's just a habit of attention shining on thought. But moreover, the nemesis isn't just shining on thought, it's also habitual behaviors. And all of these habitual behaviors lead to the decay of the human species to a certain extent. It can lend to eating in bad ways, ways that aren't beneficial, movement or the lack of movement, all of these types of things that kind of erode the human physicality are typically charged with unconscious attention, attention that is below the level of conscious recognition. I guess normally, Donna, when I say recognition, I usually involve the word conscious. I usually say conscious recognition rather than conscious or unconscious, because that word is also
Inside and outside reminds me of my bubble of perception, reminds me of populating the data. Above and below doesn't click for me. I mean, I understand it,
yeah.
and we use those words for communication, but inside and outside is the way that I see it.
That could still get confusing because you can still be operating below the level of recognition inside your bubble of perception, such as looking at your cell phone, because your cell phone is in your bubble of perception, but you're just mindlessly looking at it. But I do get what you're saying.
But
Outside,
then it's a balance thing,
yeah,
because there's nothing really wrong with my cell phone.
not necessarily.
No, it's just if it's out of balance.
Right. Yeah, write it down and move on, but then also allow things to change. As new information and new knowledge emerges, then definitions by definition will change. All right, so that's the nemesis, and it is one of the fundamental factors to the decay of the human species, the destruction that we're witnessing on our planet. And as William pointed out, it's pivotal. Like, it's so important that in whatever way, however people do it, they find ways to be more consciously aware of their environment, of the direction of their mind, their own actions. So we get into sensory attention training. That is attention, actively engaging your senses. Cognitive attention training, that is your attention actively in the moment, aware of what your mind is doing. Most people, if you ask them, they don't know. Unless they start to look at it and they're like, you know what, I guess just now I was thinking about not thinking. And it's like, okay, so you didn't, that wasn't purposeful. You know, you didn't, there was no volition, there was no intention. And then sometimes when we're doing things like that, it also goes away from our own desires. We end up doing things that we don't even really desire. I did that sometimes because I wanted to impress other people. And I was so habitually used to doing things like that, that I put myself in positions that I did not want to be in. And it really is the cause of what we're in right now. The mind is just thinking all the time. And on average, people are not deliberately pointing the flashlight of their attention. It's a water hose that nobody's holding. And the nemesis lends to the destroyers. And now I'm not going to get into what all the destroyers are, because there could be more. I've just isolated a few of them. But the mind that is below the level of recognition can be manipulated. It can be controlled to a certain extent. And it starts to degrade the fabric of our essence, of our being. And we're getting to the critical point where humanity could potentially not survive. I truly believe that. Like, the planet that we're living on is in a complete state of decay. And I'm not talking about global warming, because people, that's still a controversial topic. You can just look at ecosystems and species count. The decline of species relative to new species emerging is wildly disproportional. Ecosystems are wildly out of balance way before they should, because of human involvement. because direct human intervention has caused these ecosystems to be thrown out of. They'll rebalance themselves. That's what they do. But all of the organisms relying on that balance may not have the opportunity to change over time and adapt, and they will not survive in that example. And the human being, evolution is directly proportional to the mind and body's ability to adapt. We saw with COVID-19 that is in short supply. You mean I can't go to the bar this weekend? I want my freedom. It's like, you have to stay home for a couple weeks. Like, grow up, you'll be okay.
I lost my practice. I lost my practice in the drugstore. I needed to pick up something, and two women were walking, and one of them was sniffing heavy snot, and she was obviously sick, and she wasn't masked. And then she got to the end of the row, and then I went back to looking for the item because I noticed that, and it started to pull me out of my balance. So I noticed that, and then she sneezed 3 times in a row into the air. Just into the air. Now, I just recently got out of the emergency room where there were so many sick people and a 5.5-hour wait. And I almost swore and yelled across, like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, what level of recognition are you at to be able to do that at this time? Like, do you have a television, a newspaper, any sense of awareness whatsoever? So I just wrapped my scarf around my head and I checked out and left. And I was like, wait a minute, where's your practice? But it was gone. It was gone. I went down a rabbit hole real quick.
And
I was thinking about intervening and getting a mask out of my bag and giving it to her. And then I just said, what are you doing?
rapid
Where are your feet? How do your socks feel in your shoes? Get the hell out of here.
Right. Most people don't like to be confronted, and that's typically not the path to agreement. Typically.
The one that gets me going is on the way into town yesterday for errands. People looking at their phone, and you're going 50 miles an hour in a piece of machinery, and you're looking at your phone. Our brains aren't that developed. Can't do it. You can't do it. It's like driving drunk. It's not going to work.
Yeah. I mean, you might get away with it for now, until you don't, until somebody jumps out at you. We see it all the time. Like you don't really have to honk your horn going through alleys in Chicago. You just have to slow down. As long as you're going slow enough, you'll be able to stop. But people don't do that. They want to go through an alley at 35 miles an hour. For what? Like, what is so important that you're willing to put your own life and other people's life, and it's not rational. There's no logic. There's no deduction. Those aspects of cognition are cut off because of the ingrained feedback loop that is habit. And that is below the level or below conscious recognition. There is no conscious recognition occurring. It's all just habit, the momentum of habit, and it is corrosive.
I was driving on the expressway the other day, and so road rage is available to explore, because there's plenty of opportunities on the highway. And a car behind me just had to get by me and passed me on the right and cut me off. And I was going the speed limit, a little over, and they would just I don't think it was mindless, though. I think that person, in my opinion, was deliberately going fast because they like to go fast. They like to pretend they're playing a video game, they're race car drivers or something. And there's some thrill in cutting in and out of traffic and getting to the beginning before anybody else, So, and that confuses me a little because it is deliberate. It is a choice. I mean, they have chosen to drive recklessly because it's exciting, or I don't know what exactly it is, but it is a deliberate choice. I don't know if it's a habit. I mean, it might be.
It is a habit at that point. It is a habit. So maybe, their love for driving fast was there. Maybe, they have a reason for the reason that they're doing it, but it has fallen below the level of recognition to where they're dumb, deaf, and blind to the world around them because they're too busy engaging that habit. If they weren't, then they would be able to recognize that they're putting other people in danger. They're not even really running late. They would come to similar conclusions that we come to when we look at it. But I can almost assure you that they're acting habitually, and driving is one of the main times that you'll see a person's mind engaging habitually, because the act of driving is using all of these forms of memory. They're using their muscle memory, working memory, long-term memory, and the whole time that they're thinking about you being a shitty driver and all of these people, and let's get these snowflakes off the road driving slightly over the speed limit. No, I can almost guarantee you that there is no conscious recognition occurring. All right, see you, William. We're almost done here. So it might look like a choice, and maybe it was once upon a time. It has grown and become an ingrained and established habit. Very likely. Yeah. So if you ask them why, they wouldn't be able to tell you. Why? I like to drive fast. Why? Well, just, it's thrilling. Okay, so putting my life and my family's life at risk is thrilling to you. That definitely seems like a below the level of conscious recognition thing occurring. All right. Any more questions, comments, or concerns? So the Nemesis lends to the four destroyers, such as social habits. A lot of those things are social. People, they think that they're supposed to drive a certain way, and they think that they're supposed to, but they're doing it because their mind is moving fast. They're impatient in general, and that is all a result of the Nemesis. If somebody were above, or if somebody were operating at the level of conscious recognition, or they were consciously recognizing their environment, they would see that they're speeding up to a stoplight. And then logically, they would come to the conclusion that that's futile, that makes no sense. So one of the indications, Gene, that somebody is below the level of conscious recognition is that there's no logic, reason, or deduction to what they're doing. Does that make sense? There's no logic to speeding on the interstate that way. You get there maybe a fraction of a second faster. You got there 15 seconds faster, and you endangered thousands of lives in the process. I'm pretty sure Spock would have something to say about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know. I'm really not sure I know. I see so many people driving recklessly, and it is as if they don't really care about my safety or well-being. But anyway, they behave as if the only person that existed was them in their vehicle, and they want to be fast or first, independent of how I feel about it.
Absolutely. And that's all an indication of the decay that I'm talking about.
Oh, no, I agree. It's decay. There's no question about
that. The incessant tendency to compete, the incessant tendency to be first, to be best, to be better than everybody else. And it's like, you're in a 2005, Chevy Malibu. Like, let's just calm down. You're on a straightaway interstate. That takes no skill. You're literally just accelerating on a straightaway interstate. Like, you've done nothing that requires the accumulation of skill. But it's just a below the level of recognition. It's an unconscious habit. They're stuck in these habits and these routines, and it absolutely gets to the point of, if it's not beneficial for the species, for one another, that is an indication of decay. That is an indication of the destroyers at work, because we'll start to destroy ourselves. We'll start to risk each other's lives and our own lives in trivial, stupid things that don't really matter. You're going to get to your destination 17 seconds later than if you would have endangered everybody's life on the interstate. Especially in Chicago, because you will come to construction, or you will come to a bottleneck at some point. So just relax, just enjoy the drive, be aware of everything around. I can almost guarantee that those people that are doing that, they're not consciously engaging. They're not aware of the direction of their attention. It's all just working memory, long-term memory, motor memory, and a lot of thought. That's what leads to the road rage, is the rage and the thought and the anger, and everything just starts to boil. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The Nemesis feeding the four destroyers. The habits that we've created already, social habits, some of those things are highly social. That's why my brothers all drive that way. It's a part of their social construct to be a badass who can drive on interstates faster than everybody else. And it's like, What?
Very manly, very manly.
And typically it is the male mindset. Yes. The male mind specifically may have needed their aggression at a certain point in our evolution against the bear. We don't need it anymore. Like, we just don't need to do these things. And before you know it, we have wars for resources that there's plenty of. We have war over land that there's plenty of. We have war over religion that's just a belief anyway. And it's all just highly dysfunctional, and you can see it as a part of the decay of the species. That's how you know that the four destroyers are destroying. They're doing their
I will admit that I smile at the driver of a car that I pull up next to at a stoplight, who had previously looked at me and flipped me the bird because I was in their way in some way. I wasn't going fast enough or something that they needed to get by. And we ended up at the stoplight at the same time anyway. And so I like to smile at them. And then when I feel myself getting too smug, which I just like a little bit of smug, I imagine myself turning into Bugs Bunny and then back into myself, and then I laugh at myself, and then I can let it go. But I do spend a little time getting satisfaction out of that moment.
Hmm. Well, I'm not going to judge that.
Judge it, I'm okay with it.
I would still be careful with that to a certain extent. But like you said, it sounds like you're aware of that potential imbalance of the smugness. And sometimes that smugness in Chicago will get you shot. So, you know, you look at somebody the wrong way with a smug look on your face, and they'll pull a 9mm and watch that smug wipe right off your face. There's road rage on Chicago interstates every single day, and some leading to homicide. So I'm just pretty much like, I'll speed up now. I used to kind of just walk nonchalantly because it's my right. Now I'll even stop and walk even quicker just to get by, so that we don't even have to have a conflict.
Yeah, smiles confuse angry people, and by then I've pulled away. So
Mhm.
it's confused of why I'm being so nice to them when they hate me so much.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as you're not knowingly antagonizing, then that's when it starts to get out of balance. Yeah, because if you're knowingly antagonizing someone with your smiles and your smug look, that could equal an opposite extreme that you may not necessarily want. But it's
Yeah, I recognize they can't hear me, so that's a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And that's another indication of below the level of recognition, Gene. Why would you yell at drivers that can't hear you? Why would you get mad at somebody for driving slightly above the speed limit? They're already speeding. They're already breaking the law for you, and you have the audacity to get mad at them because they're not meeting your expectations. It's like the horn in Chicago. The horn is to alert somebody of impending impact, right? It's an emergency use to let somebody know that your vehicles are about to occupy the same space. They don't do that. They use their horn when you're not meeting their driving expectations. You didn't start fast enough. You didn't slow fast enough. You're just not doing it the way they want you to do it. So
Well,
they,
that's New York too. New York, it's impatience.
oh,
That's
I
all.
imagine it's
Just
impatience.
Yeah.
Yes. And, you know, sometimes we talk about the virtues of alignment, patience, you know, recognizing the good of the group, logic, reason, deduction, compassion, empathy. We look at those as clear the space and the species starts to act functionally again. That's the bottom line. Cloud it up with more habit, the momentum of habit, and all of a sudden you're not compassionate, you're not caring, you're not kind. All of those things start to go by the wayside. That's an indication of the destroyers doing their work. They're literally destroying the fabric of the human species because the mind is operating below the level of conscious recognition. And the spiritual groups, the talking groups, it's the same thing. It's just going from one type of talking to another type of talking, but they're not really taking a hold of the water hose and pointing it where they want it to go on purpose. Sometimes in, you know, maybe a little bit of a meditative practice or a little bit of a yoga practice, and I think that's great. We need informal. We need to be doing it more often than we're doing anything else. Jerry, we're going to add something before we
I
head
was
up?
just going to say that you brought up a really scary point a couple minutes ago where you take all of those things you just said, and then many people are they're packing. They've got guns on them, and they're just whipping them out. I mean, I don't know. Do you have like daily murder counts up in Chicago that are pretty high? Because I've heard just overall Chicago is just the number one
It's
for
not.
murders.
It's not.
That
No. Per
no.
capita, it's definitely not. No, I think Chicago's like 30th or something like that per capita.
Okay, maybe it's came down, but I know at one point Chicago was just
It's
oh,
a
but
lot still. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's 3 million people in the city, and then the metropolitan area, there's like 11 million. So yeah, there's stories every single day of petty theft, murder, homicide, and some of the craziest things. But it's happening all over the country, especially in populated areas. Anywhere there's a populated area, it's usually white men that are doing really, really crazy things. And then,
Happening for a long time. My
yeah,
father's been dead a long time, and I remember because he used to get road rage and yell at the guy next to him because it was the loudest, scariest one wins. And he came from an old school of, they go out behind the bar and have a fight, and then they walk back in friends and have a drink. That mentality. My father wasn't a drinker, but just that mentality. And I was like, Dad, you can't scream at people on the road because someone's going to shoot you. Like, it's not worth it. Let them cut you off. Like, and that was years ago. So yeah, that's been going on a long time.
mhm.
Road
And
rage
it's just
and
getting worse. Yeah. You have below the level of recognition that's coming from states of poverty, states of, where people don't have enough resources. And then you have the unconscious, decay where they have plenty of resources, right? They have money, they have, houses and cars, but they're still operating below the level of recognition, creating a different kind of suffering than folks who are in poverty. And they're looking at that like, I want that, I want that. And the American capitalistic dream just lends to more unconsciousness.
same principles, same dynamic.
Exactly. The more that you're operating below the level of recognition, the easier it is to turn you into a mindless consumer. Sorry, not sorry, but mindless consumerism is an indication of the destroyers. They're hard at work destroying the fabric of our society and our species.
I make a joke at the register when I buy something that's, the quick grab item at the end of I go, oh, look, very smart marketing. They got my numb mind. They got me. I'm buying this chocolate covered whatever.
Yep. Yeah, most people do have expensive cell phones. I've had this one now for, I think, 5 years or 4 years, and I will not buy another cell phone until this thing explodes. Like or they'll slow it down or whatever, and I don't care.
It explodes right when there's an update because you stop paying the bill.
Oh,
Your phone is paid for and it suddenly dies, like, right.
It's going to happen any minute then, because I've paid
Yeah.
this thing off, and literally every 2 days I get a new deal for a new phone. It's like, no, like your camera isn't that much better that I'm just going to go spend another $800, on a cell phone. I just don't see it.
Mine seemed to only last 5 years. It seems like, man, I'll go 5 years and then it's just dying.
Technology.
I gotta get another one.
And I'm just going to get
Designed that way.
something that has basic text function. If this thing blows up, I'm getting the cheapest shit on the shelf. I don't care. But you're not going to turn me into a mindless consumer. There's things that I need and want, and that's fine. But I'm not going to be a mindless robot just buying a bunch of shit that I don't need, don't want, and that only contributes to a world that is even more in the grip of the 4 and 5 destroyers. It's the 5th destroyer that's the real Dickens. The 5th destroyer is the collective momentum of human society, of the human condition. And we are so derailed at this point, we very well could destroy ourselves and everything else in the process. It is a real possibility.
Like lemmings running off the cliff.
Exactly. That's exactly an example. And Democrats and Republicans alike are running off that cliff. It's not one or the other. Like, it's not this binary, I'm right, you're wrong bullshit. It's, where is our mind? Have we put it there? The answer is yes or no. If the answer is yes, we're above this level of conscious recognition. If the answer is no, we are below the level of conscious recognition, and we're acting almost completely on the momentum of our own established habits. And they revolve primarily around the habits we've created already, social habits, biological habits, and entertainment factors.
well, I don't know, the GOP, they've totally gone off the rails. I'm kidding.
I know,
Um, Since we're talking about cell phones, I was just going to say, we have talked about this before. For everybody in the room, just a little PSA here. Go into the sales department, ask for the sales department, ask them, what older models they have. Like right now, we got the S20 22 or something. They were free. It was a special at the time. But go into the sales department, just ask them. They'll have 20s, 18s. They don't go back too far, but they're selling them for pennies on the dollar. You can buy refurbished ones. So when you get ready to get a phone, go to the sales department, find out what models they have that are still sitting around. They might have just a few left. They'll mail them for free, and you'll get a $800,000 phone for maybe a couple $100, 150 or something. Just sharing.
yeah. And then they'll get you with the contract, the data plan. And then before you know it,
This one, when we did our free one, we did get that, and I haven't done that in a while, but hey, I'm good with Verizon. But no, the other phones, you're not getting a contract with them. It's just a purchase.
mhm. Yeah, I think my next phone, I'm not gonna have a data plan. I'm not gonna have any contracts. I'm just gonna let all that shit go, just like I've let subscriptions go, and I've just really focused these things. Again, Netflix isn't evil, not necessarily, but how many subscriptions does the average person actually have? I think it will blow your mind. And then we talk about cost of living. Well, are we including the 13 different television subscriptions in our cost of living? Well, no wonder you're struggling. I'm just saying, yeah. But the specificity of what we're talking about here is neither good nor bad, plus or minus. We can have cell phones, we can have these things. The more that we're operating above the level of recognition, the more that our mind is deliberate in nature, our attention is deliberate in nature, the more that we'll be able to sift through these things for ourselves in our own way, in a way that we personally feel comfortable. Maybe it's letting your cell phone go. Maybe it's letting some of the accumulation of things and stuff. Maybe it's having it, but not really attaching and clinging to it as much. Maybe Gene has an artifact that has family history. He doesn't want to get rid of it. But then again, if space junk fell from the sky and the house burnt down, he'd be more happy that everybody got out, and he wouldn't even think about that thing and that stuff. It was there while it lasted. I appreciated it. And now it's time for it to disappear into the ether, like everything will eventually anyway. Right? So we can find balance with a wide variety of things, and we don't need to judge each other. And maybe Gene just grew up with machinery and he just loves complex machinery. And sometimes vehicles, they can be a great example of engineering precision. Then again, he might come to a time where his watch is also engineering precision, so he just doesn't feel the need for these things as much anymore. Or maybe he has the nice car, but he doesn't cling and attach to it. So if space junk fell from the sky, hey, that shit just happened and I'm okay with it. I enjoyed it while it lasted and I can move on. That is adaptability. So you'll always be able to determine how much the destroyers and the Nemesis have a hold on you based on how easily you can go without something and adapt to change. If your bars are taken away and you flip your shit, if you're not able to go outside as often as you want and do the things that you want, and you have to wear a mask and you just flip your shit, you're probably not that adaptable. And then you're like, rawr, freedom. And it's like, okay, what happens when we have a disease that has maybe a 60% mortality rate? Are you going to stay home then? Are you going to do some social distancing then? Like, what does it take for you to consider other people? Even if they are wrong, I'm okay. Like, they could be right. So wearing a mask could help somebody. I'm okay if they're wrong, and I'm okay if they're right. But I'm going to take the steps necessary to do my best to take other people into consideration. Even if it means wearing a mask or not going outside for a month or two. I'm okay. Like, I'll adapt. It might not always be fun. It might not always be desirable. You do want to go to the sporting event. You do want to get together with all your yoga buddies. But right now, it's not advisable. So let's just adapt and keep swimming. Most people aren't very adaptable. You take their beer away, they're flipping their shit. You know, you take their cars away, or you take their guns away, and heaven forbid, we're just going to flip our shit. So, yeah. All right. Any questions about the Nemesis? The mind that is operating below the level of deliberate choice with attention. Otherwise, that could get convoluted. Where is your attention, and did you put it there? Have you specifically, deliberately, and intentionally put your mind on the act of driving? For example, for most people, the answer is no. All right. So I will see you guys again next Tuesday for topic number 3, and I'll let you know what that topic is sometime through the middle of the week. Otherwise, we'll be here Thursday for more group study. I am doing the certifications of the Bridge Mindfulness System. It's not a certification factory. It's none of that type of stuff. If space junk falls from the sky, you know, I want other people to be able to pick this up and run with it if they see fit. Hopefully that none of those scenarios occur, though. But ultimately, you know, the system is shareable. It is very organized, and I am perfectly comfortable with people sharing aspects of it, eventually sharing the entire thing. And then I can break all that stuff down as well. When we get to the final layer towards the end of hydrostacy, I will offer formal practices, formal standing meditation, sitting meditation, moving meditation, laying down meditation, bone marrow washing, all kinds of things that I can offer that I've learned, and you can do them. Eventually, if you wanted to teach something like that, you have to have a discipline to share. Whether it's yoga, whether it's Pilates, whether it's the piano, whether it's tennis, but it's sharing a deliberate practice that you yourself do at a certain level or a certain layer of this. And that doesn't ever have to be there. You don't ever have to share. But if you wanted to share the full scope of the Bridge Mindfulness System at a certain point, you have to be able to offer some sort of deliberate formal practice to them, whatever that looks like. I'll have several. So I'll have maybe 5 or 6 different things that I can share from different disciplines. You don't need that many. A person could just have one, just one
Do
thing.
you mean a physical practice?
Yes. Physical, it could be cognitive as well. Chess, maybe you're a chess master. You're just really good at chess, and you want to teach somebody how to focus and use their awareness and their mindfulness practice to focus in on the act of playing chess.
Art,
What's that?
painting.
It could be
Painting.
painting. Yes. It could be de-arming bombs, if that's something that you're really good at and requires a lot of attention and focus. I'm going to do yoga, qigong, tai chi, and formal meditation. Mindfulness meditation as well as like different types of visual meditations and things like that. I borrow some things from the ancients to create something a little bit new. All that makes sense? Okay. Well, I will see you guys again on Thursday if you can make it. And thanks for hanging out. And I'll put this recording up onto YouTube today before I go to work. All right. All right. See you guys. Thanks for hanging out. I'll
Thanks,
go back
Ernest.
to the whiteboard and save the whiteboard real quick. Because if I don't save it, it doesn't save. Save. Okay. All right. So I'll see you guys on Thursday.